Night has fallen over the tiny town like a black blanket, hiding all shadows and fears. The air is soaked with tension, and somewhere in the distance, the wail of police sirens rings in my ears, gets under my skin, and makes my heart beat faster. On a deserted street, lit only by the dim light of a lone street lamp, a girl in a wheelchair moves slowly. Each turn of the wheels echoes loudly in the silence, like a whisper of her fragility and helplessness. She hurries to get home, for the cold is getting into her bones, and the rare passers-by have long since disappeared into their homes. The girl tries to ignore the flickering police flashing lights that reflect off the walls of the houses, making everything around her look like an endless maze of red and blue glare. Her fingers frantically grip the rim of her wheelchair when suddenly there is a shrill screech of brakes behind her. Like thunder in the middle of the night, the patrol car stops right behind her. Something inside the girl shatters. A strange, icy emptiness suddenly grips her mind. Her mind flashes with dark stories of injustice and police brutality, of how those who are in the wrong place at the wrong time often disappear at night. She has only time to take a deep breath before the sound of a door slamming shut comes from the car. And there she sits, frozen in her wheelchair, alone with an unknown threat. Her heart beats a resounding rhythm, like a drum calling for alarm. A bright flashlight beam falls on her from above, revealing her terrified face from the darkness. A short, almost silent plea escapes her lips as she realizes that no one will come to her aid in this dark night. The silence is cut again by the police sirens, no longer in the distance but overhead, like an ominous chorus preparing to pronounce judgment. The girl presses her lips together, trying not to let her despair show. Everything inside tells her to pull herself together and not show fear, but her mind screams the opposite. You're in danger, run. She can't run, she's in a wheelchair. And this terrifying paradox only intensifies the wave of panic that is building up. The city seemed to have died out. Not a single passerby, not a single sound except the howling of the wind and the ominous murmur of the car behind her. The girl slowly turns her head and sees an officer getting out of the car. His silhouette seems unrealistically large in the light of the headlights, and his hand is already reaching for the holster on his belt. At that moment, she realizes that the worst is yet to come. She held her breath, trying to control herself, but inside she was trembling. A short order, spoken in a rough, harsh voice, comes through the buzzing in her ears, followed by dead silence. And that silence seemed 100 times more terrifying than any scream. Thus begins a story on a cold, lifeless night that soon turns into a real nightmare. The girl barely had time to exhale before the silence of the night was broken by a sharp shout. "Hands up!" The rough, hate-soaked voice rumbled as if it could pierce concrete. She froze, unable to move. In the light of the bright lantern shining in her face, the wheelchair-bound girl could only make out the silhouette of the officer. A thick, dark aura of hostility seemed to emanate from his figure. "What are you doing here, huh?" he continued, his hand still on his holster. "Did you forget where you're not supposed to be?" His words sounded not just dislike, but a kind of pathological malice. The girl was silent, swallowing the lump in her throat with difficulty. Fear clenched her heart with an iron grip. Inside, everything was saying, "Don't move, don't annoy him." But the officer did not stop. "I said, put your hands up," he shouted, pulling the safety off his gun. "Or don't you understand humanity?" He didn't even try to hide his disgust. It was like his gaze was screaming, "You're nothing." The bright light of the spotlight made her trembling hands ugly, glistening with sweat and tears. She tried to lift them, but fear stiffened her joints. Seeing her hesitation, the officer abruptly pulled his weapon and pointed the muzzle directly at the girl's head. "Are you deaf?" he hissed with contempt. "Or are you just pretending to be a victim?" As if to confirm his words, the officer moved closer, pressing his foot on the front wheel of the wheelchair, causing it to jerk. Her whole life seemed to shrink into a tiny dot in that instant. She didn't want to believe that all this was happening in reality. The ominous night, the heavy sight of the gun, and, most importantly, the chilling, senseless hatred in the eyes of the man who was supposed to be upholding the law. "Answer me, you bloody," he stammered, grinning evilly, "you bloody beggar, or whatever it is you do on the streets at night." With every word he spoke, more venom and racism poured out onto the street. Each phrase, filled with contempt for her skin color, for her helpless condition, hit harder than any blow. The girl pressed her lips together, trying not to cry or show weakness, but the tears were already stinging her eyes. The officer yanked her sleeve in anger, making her almost fly out of the wheelchair. "You think, because you're in a wheelchair, you can walk around wherever you want? And it's black too. God, you're all the same, looking for a bargain." She never thought it was possible to hear so much hatred from one man. All his words, soaked with racial slurs, blunt hatred, and personal hatred for her condition, burned her soul with unbearable humiliation. A desperate cry grew in the girl's breast. Why me? For what? But she could not utter a sound, and the officer continued to yell as if reveling in her fear. "I swear, I have every reason to shoot you if you move again. You're dysfunctional, aren't you? So come clean." He pressed the barrel of the gun to her forehead, and the girl felt the coldness of the metal penetrating her consciousness with terror. Her brain frantically tried to find a way out. Maybe someone would hear. Maybe someone would call for help. But the street was empty, and only the howling of sirens on the other side of the city faintly reminded her that there was life out there somewhere. At that moment, she realized that in this man's eyes she was really nothing, just a suspicious element, an insignificant creature to be ordered, intimidated, humiliated. Her helplessness, her wheelchair, her skin color, all this became an occasion for him to vent his accumulated anger. So, amidst the darkness and indifference, the girl felt her world crumbling right here and now, under the pressure of someone else's cruelty. And no one around her rushed to help stop this madness. No one yet knew what explosion was coming when the truth was revealed, and in that moment, on an icy road, in the crosshairs of a racist policeman, her life hung on the thin line between despair and hopelessness. "Come on, tell me what you've got stashed away, drug dealer," shouts the officer, keeping the girl in his sights. His eyes burn with inhuman hatred and his voice rings with arrogance. "I know you black people always carry shit with you. Don't you lie to me." He steps on one of the wheels of the wheelchair, as if trying to pierce it with cold metal. The girl tries to gather her will in a fist, but the anger in the policeman's eyes is so frightening that it takes her breath away. She frantically shifts her gaze from the weapon to the officer's face, trying to utter a word in her defense. "Look, I'm just going back." Her voice shakes, broken, laced with a lump of fear. "I need to go home." "Home?" He grins with obvious contempt. "What kind of dump do you live in? You all live like animals and lie like animals. You think if you're in that damn wheelchair I'm going to be ceremonious?" He grabs the girl's arm, yanking so hard that the wheelchair tumbles sideways. The wheels squeak pitifully on the asphalt. The girl cries out in pain and horror. It seems to her that just a little more, and the fragile bones will not stand. She tries to explain that she has done nothing wrong, but the words are drowned in the aggression that overwhelms the officer. "What are you babbling about?" He leans closer, baring his teeth. "You think I can't see what I'm dealing with? You're trash, okay? You're trash that should be off our streets a long time ago." With each insult, the girl feels her insides clench with humiliation. Tears come to her eyes, but she tries her best to hold back. The policeman notices this and seems to grow even more furious. His face shows his obvious pleasure at her helplessness. "I can't believe you're even allowed to exist," he snorted, looking her over from head to toe. "Did you think you'd ride around unnoticed? There's no slack around here just because you're in a wheelchair and have dark skin. I will deal with you severely." Every word he says is poisoned with racism, every pause filled with threat and lust for power. The girl tries to object, but another tug twists her arm painfully. A sharp pain shoots through her shoulder and a groan escapes her throat. The officer gives her a look of squeamishness, as if she were contagious or unclean, as he repeated, "Shut up." He pins her hand to the ground, keeping her down. "No one's gonna help you. No one will listen to what you're telling yourself. You'll sit in the station until you confess to all the sins I've accused you of." The lantern light still dances above them, highlighting every drop of fear and despair on the girl's face. Police sirens are somewhere far away, like an unreachable echo of a civilization that is in no hurry to lend her a helping hand. In that moment, it seems to her that all of humanity has turned its back on her, that she is alone with the embodiment of cruelty and hatred. "Why are you doing this?" Finally, a quiet, almost pleading question comes out of her mouth. The officer only grins crookedly and tosses back, "Because I can. No one can stop me." His words are confident, fueled by dozens of similar cases that no one has ever heard of. He enjoys the power. He's facing a helpless victim, unable to get out of her wheelchair, and he intends to make the most of the situation. Despair mixed with rage grows inside the girl, a silent plea for a miracle. But at this moment it seems that there are no miracles. She is so helpless, so vulnerable, and in the face of merciless injustice, she remains just a suspicious element, as the racist policeman called her, spewing his evil without restraint. And the night thickens more and more, and every heartbeat echoes with the painful question, "What will happen next?" Her voice trembled like a thin string, ready to break at any moment, and tears ran down her cheeks in hot streaks. Against her will, she sobbed quietly, hoping that the officer would be touched in some way by her helplessness. But instead of sympathy, he responded with a cold, hard laugh that sent chills down her spine. "Who are you counting on, you goddamn invalid?" he hissed, leaning closer. "You think if you cry, you'll get away with it?" The wheelchair tipped sideways, hitting the wet asphalt with a resounding thud. The girl cried out, feeling her body sliding on the rough surface. Her hands shook with pain and fear, and her mind jumbled into one. The slipping seatbelt, the sharp pain in her side, the bitter thought that she could neither get up nor run away. Her most vulnerable state now an open target for this cruel man. But the policeman didn't stop. As if it wasn't enough for him to just throw the girl to the ground, he put his heavy boot firmly on her back, pressing her into the wet asphalt. She felt her ribs cracking under that merciless pressure and her heart trying to burst out of her chest. The only sounds in the air were the quiet sobs and paused breathing of her victim. "And here you are," He stressed the last word as if he were using the most disgusting swear word. "You think you have any rights here? Sneaking around at night, selling drugs, and then whining about being mistreated?" A vile wave of racism emanated from every word of his voice. Every insult hit her dignity harder than physical blows. It was as if he was deliberately dividing the world into insiders and outsiders, and she, helpless, defenseless, dark-skinned, and wheelchair-bound, was obviously one of the outsiders. "Look at her, the queen of the streets." He chuckled rudely, as if mocking her whole life. Did she dream of rolling out in her wheelchair and becoming an innocent victim? Alas, he pressed down harder with his foot. Today is not your day. There was no sympathy in his gaze, only a grim determination to see it through, as if he had discovered not a human being, but a hideous pest. The girl felt her body shudder beneath him, and a wave of helplessness swept over her head. She was ready to scream for help, for mercy, but her voice weakened under the pressure. Each breath came with difficulty. She whispered desperately, "Please, I didn't do anything wrong, just driving home." But her pleas shattered against a thick wall of hatred. "Nothing wrong? You all say that," he shouted with such contempt that the girl flinched. "It's all right. When you're in the penitentiary, you'll remember this moment. There, you'll explain who you are and where you come from." The boot still pressed against her back, making it impossible for her to move. She could feel the mud and water from the road soaking into her clothes, and the tears were drying on her face. It was as if the world had gone mad. Her life had been turned upside down in an instant, and no one around her was trying to stop the nightmare. "Oh, come on." It finally came out of her, full of despair. "I really didn't." But the officer only grinned. "Shut up. No one wants to hear your excuses. You'll always be trash to me, do you understand?" His evil grin turned into a shrill laugh. "And nobody cares what you think." His words hurt more than slaps. She felt something sharp curl in her chest, a mixture of bitterness, resentment, and humiliation. Never before had she experienced such a total sense of helplessness. Even the very thought that someone might hate her just because of her skin color and wheelchair melted her mind. But it was all too real. Her body felt cold on the cold pavement, and her heart threatened to jump out of her chest in despair. The rattle of the radio in the officer's car, the background howl of the sirens in the distance, it all merged into one endless nightmare. And every word he said, every second of aggression seemed like an eternity. No one even guessed how this tragic encounter would end. But one thing was clear. At that moment she was lying there, crushed and humiliated, powerless before the cruelty that knew no bounds. Through her own screams and the wail of police sirens, the girl suddenly recognizes the rustle of voices around her. At first, she does not realize where the noise is coming from, but then, through her tears and horror, she notices the figures of people. They stand far away, as if mesmerized by the gruesome scene of a racist officer pinning a defenseless black girl to the ground, lying next to an overturned wheelchair. Someone in the crowd picks up his phone to take a picture of what is happening. His eyes are not sympathetic or indignant, but coldly interested, as if it were just another video that he would upload to social networks for likes. Neighbors, passers-by, and just gawkers are shuffling from foot to foot, looking at the girl in the wheelchair in bewilderment. But no one makes a step to help. "She must have done something wrong to be pinned down like that," came a whisper from the middle of the crowd. "Yeah, well, they're always guilty of something," a quiet but sarcastic voice echoed. They The girl's lips quiver as she hears these derogatory words. It's as if she and all those who look like her in skin color have been lumped into one common image of guilty beings, unworthy of even pity. The officer's feet are still pressing her into the wet asphalt, and she can barely move. It hurts to breathe. It hurts to speak, but it hurts even more to hear people whispering around her, not trying to stop the obvious cruelty. The officer looks up, noticing that he is being filmed. Instead of being frightened, he smirks, straightening his back proudly. It's as if all this publicity is just fueling the fire of his dark vanity. He basks in the attention, as if he were an actor on stage, the girl his submissive puppet in a macabre performance. "See?" He almost shouts toward the crowd, lifting his shoe slightly off the girl's back, but immediately putting it back in place, pressing harder. They always think they can do whatever they want. But no, there's only one law for them in this town. Keep your head down and keep your head down. With these words, he makes it clear that even a wheelchair does not arouse in him an ounce of compassion. For him, it is just a way to hide from a just punishment. He doesn't care that her legs don't move, that she needs help and protection. The main thing for him is to show his power and get the approval of the crowd, which with each passing moment becomes more and more like soulless extras in the theater of the absurd. Someone is taking video from the sidelines, talking quietly. "She shouldn't be out on the street so late," mutters a woman in a cap, clearly justifying the policeman's actions. "Yes, and anyway, a wheelchair doesn't mean she can't be a criminal," another voice adds, as if trying to justify the whole horrifying act. The girl desperately clenches her teeth, feeling everything inside her clench with helplessness. She begins to realize that for many in this crowd she is really not a person, but a problem that can be trampled, blamed, humiliated with impunity. The world at these moments seems infinitely alien and cold to her. The policeman turns his eyes to the person shooting the video. "Take it off. Take it off. Let everyone see what happens to people who do what they're told." He presses his boot against her back again. "You hear that, girl? That's justice." She tries to squeeze out a word, even a moan, but she realizes that she can no longer control her voice. Panic grips her chest, and tears and pain mingle in an acrid cocktail of despair. Everything swims before her eyes, and in this haze she sees only indifferent faces, some looking away to avoid participating, others filming, some laughing quietly, and some not even hiding their contemptuous curiosity. The agonizing seconds drag on, and time seems to stand still. Warm blood or tears, she can hardly tell which, burn her cheek, and it seems that there is no escape. The crowd grows, but no one dares to stand up for her. It's just a normal night in a place where racism has long been the norm, and the pain of others is a fascinating spectacle for outsiders. And in the heat of the infernal humiliation, the girl suddenly feels that everything inside her burns out. Her tears dry up, her screams fall silent. Her consciousness sinks into a deafening indifference. There is no strength to resist. And it seems that this endless night is just a prologue to even more horrifying events that are about to happen. In the midst of the gloomy crowd, watching the humiliation of a girl in a wheelchair, stands a boy of about 12. His eyes are wide with horror, reflecting all the horrifying details of what is happening. He clutches an old telephone in his hands, white knuckles reminding himself that he must do something. He is the little brother of the same girl who is now being booted by a racist cop. The child can hardly breathe, trying to disconnect himself from what he hears and sees. The disgusting words the cop hurls at his sister, the taunts of the gawkers, the heavy breathing of the girl herself, pinned to the pavement. He wants to throw himself at the big man in the uniform, but he realizes he has something more effective to do. He slowly steps away from the crowd, trying not to attract attention, and leans his back against the wall of the nearest building. His hands shake. His fingers struggle to work the buttons, but finally a familiar name lights up on the screen. The number Grandpa. This grandfather he recruits is no ordinary pensioner, no good-natured old man who greets his grandchildren with pancakes and warmth. No, this is the city's police chief, a man who inspires fear in the entire city. Many hate him for his toughness and uncompromising nature. Some respect him for the order he has managed to establish, but every single one fears his determination and heartless reputation. When he took cases, criminals would flee the city, and some officers would quit, unwilling to deal with him. The boy hopes that it is now that this stiffness may save his sister's life. He, stammering with sobs and fear, struggles to utter, "Grandfather, nah, help, it's sister. She is being beaten by a policeman here." There is a long silence on the other end of the phone. The boy hears only intermittent breathing. It seems that the grandfather almost does not believe his ears. After all, such brazen and inhuman treatment of a person, and even with a child in a wheelchair, is so blatant that it is hard to imagine that any of his subordinates would dare to do such a thing. But his grandson's voice does not lie. Every sob and sob confirms the terrible reality. "Where are you?" A heavy, low bass finally breaks the silence. The boy frantically explains which street they are on, describes the patrol car, and, feeling that the connection is about to break, squeezes out one last thing. "He's going to kill her. Please, hurry." The tube clicks off. Grandfather asks nothing more. There are no promises, no cries of indignation, just cold silence, which means he's already made up his mind. The boy, not yet fully realizing what he has done, kneels down and clutches the phone to his chest. He doesn't believe that Grandpa can be a good wizard and fix everything instantly. But he knows for sure that if there is anyone who can stop this lawlessness, it is the chief of police. At the same instant, in a small one-story house a few blocks away, a tall man in a uniform shirt abruptly throws back the blanket and leaps up from the couch. His face is stony, his eyes burning with a dangerous fire. In his hand is a bunch of keys, in the other the charger of a walkie-talkie. He doesn't waste a second, and in half a minute he's out of the house, slamming the door so hard that the windows rattle. This man is used to commanding the police with an iron grip. He is feared not only by ordinary citizens, but also by his own officers. Too often he has encountered corruption and brutality in the ranks of the defenders of law and order, and has destroyed it at the root, sparing neither old staff nor new recruits. At one look at him, his employees seem to stretch out in a string, and he does not care whether his granddaughter is in a wheelchair or not. The main thing is that she is in trouble, and next to her is some subhuman who calls himself a policeman, not knowing who he is dealing with. Meanwhile, on the street where the tragedy is unfolding, no one yet suspects the coming turn of events. People in the crowd are still watching indifferently. Some are filming on their phones, some are whispering. I wonder when it's going to end. Maybe it's a show for the video. They're always making provocations. The officer continues to humiliate the girl in the wheelchair, hurling racial slurs as if trying to prove his power. "So, you like to roll around in the dirt? That's where you belong." He looks around the crowd, expecting applause, or at least nods of approval. Somewhere in the night, the engine of a sport utility vehicle is already roaring. The police chief's heart is beating steady, but his eyes are filled with rage. He's not going to hold a trial. He's coming to punish. And underneath it all, everyone in town is clear. It's best not to get in his way when it comes to family. And so, in that instant, that very twist is born. One call, a call that will change everything. Because what began as just another act of racist lawlessness could soon turn into the worst nightmare for those who dared to touch his family. Before we continue, I would like to stop for a couple of minutes and ask you to write in the comments. Where do you listen to our stories from? Was there something similar in your life? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new exciting epics. We continue. For 11 seconds, let's pause for one more little pause and ask you to write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, whether you've encountered something similar in your life, and, of course, don't forget to subscribe. And we'll continue. The frantic roar of the engine continues to roar on the deserted night street, and the crowd of gawkers around them is still standing sleepily, when suddenly there's a shrill crackle of the radio in the officer's car. His hand flinches, and he reaches for the radio while continuing to press his boot on the back of the girl, who is still lying on the cold asphalt next to the overturned wheelchair. Through the hiss of the airwaves comes the tense voice of the dispatcher. We have received a complaint. The detainee is the granddaughter of the chief of police. Repeat, the police chief's granddaughter. These few words fly through the interior of the patrol car like thunderclaps in the stifling silence, and the officer suddenly stops breathing, realizing with all his body what a monstrous mistake he has made. His face paled to a chalky color, and his hands began to tremble visibly, as if all the tendons had suddenly tightened. A second ago, he was enjoying every moment of his racist triumph, humiliating the girl with black skin in a wheelchair, pouring all the venom of his hateful contempt on her, wanting to crush her human dignity with every word. He had yelled, calling her trash, scum, trash, filth, boasted of his power, and reveled in the fear he saw in her eyes. But now, hearing through the walkie-talkie who his victim really is, he feels all his ostensible invincibility crumble. Blood pounding loudly in his ears, and in his memory suddenly recalls the fearsome reputation of the chief of police, from whom even hardened criminals run, and even his own subordinates at the mere sight of him stretched at attention and try not to make the slightest mistake. The officer presses his boot against the girl with redoubled fury, trying to save face in front of the crowd, but his eyes no longer have the cold confidence with which he hurled racist insults. Now you can see the panicked thought in them, God, what have I done? Not only has he allowed himself such a ruthless act of child abuse, he's also chosen someone who is associated with the most incorruptible and brutal police chief this city has ever known. A few gawkers begin to exchange worried glances, someone whispering, "The chief won't forgive." Finally, the officer removes his foot from the squeezing grip and recoils, as if in fear that he has touched red-hot metal. But the girl can no longer get up on her own, for the wheelchair still lies on its side and the girl's body shivers as if every cell refuses to believe what is happening. She coughs, struggling to draw in some air, the salty taste of tears mingling with fear on her lips. Her eyes are red from the humiliation she's endured, and her face is contorted with pain. The officer retreats to his car, grabbing his radio to mumble something exculpatory, but his tongue fails. At that moment, his partner, the one who had been standing silently at a distance, runs up to him. Panic is in his eyes. He too has heard the radio messages and realizes that the police chief's granddaughter is a sentence for both of them if things go wrong. The partner throws in a husky voice, "What are you doing?" "We can't. But the officer suddenly shouts back, "Shut up!" and tries to quickly orient himself on how to get out of it, except to blame it on the girl. But whatever the lie, no one will believe she was a real threat in her wheelchair. Adrenaline pounding in his temples, the officer frantically looks around at the crowd, hoping someone will support him. But people are now trying to keep their distance, and some, realizing that a serious scandal is about to break out, are creeping back into the shadows. No one is going to get involved in his problems. It seems to him that time has stood still, and he is about to hear a familiar motor whine somewhere in the distance. The chief of police is on his way, and if he finds his granddaughter in this condition, the consequences will be disastrous. The officer glances at the girl's trembling body, the jerked wheels of the wheelchair lying on its side, the bloody abrasions and his boot marks on her clothes. A monstrous mistake is all that is pounding in his head, drowning out even the beeping of his radio and the screams of his partner. But his mind keeps telling him that there's nothing to stop. And at that very second he realizes that all the racism and power he boasted about may be the last thing he ever needs, because the most dangerous man in the city, to whom he has inflicted the worst insult of all, raising his hand on his own child, is standing in his way. The night street shudders with the wild roar of a siren that cuts through the darkness like blinding lightning in a stormy sky. It sounds so loud that the people in the crowd press their palms to their ears, and the officer caught in the act involuntarily flinches as if the siren were announcing his sentence. And at the same moment, a massive black SUV comes around the corner, out of the thick darkness, at full speed. The headlights so vividly reveal the gawkers and the girl's horrified face that for a moment it seems as if time stops. The heavy doors swung open simultaneously with a loud clang, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man in a perfectly pressed uniform. There is not a shred of doubt in his gaze, only icy fury and steely determination. This is the chief of the city police, a man whose orders are feared by even the most daring officers, and whose name alone makes the criminal elements prefer to get away from him. But now, those who stand on his side of the law are also afraid of him. After all, this giant in uniform is not just out on night patrol. He has come to rescue his granddaughter, a dark-skinned girl in a wheelchair who has just been trampled, insulted, and beaten. The crowd unconsciously parted, allowing him to enter the epicenter of the horror. No one dares to stand in his way, only to avert their eyes as if they realize that something terrible is about to unfold. There, in the circle of light from the racist policeman's car, lies a girl, knocked from her wheelchair. There are blood and dirt stains on her clothes, a mixture of horror and pain in her eyes, and standing next to her is the same officer who moments ago was enjoying his racist performance. Now he is pale, his hands are shaking, his gun is pressed against his thigh as if about to slip from his numb fingers. His partner stands next to him, equally dazed, his face a silent plea for mercy. Without a sound, the chief takes a few wide strides across the space between them. His black boots pound the pavement like hammers, beating out a merciless rhythm. As he approaches his granddaughter, he slowly gets down on one knee and gently runs his palm over her crying face. She tries to squeeze out a word, but only sobs, feeling the last of her strength draining out of her. And at that moment he glances at the officer, a look so cold and angry that it would seem to freeze the blood of anyone who dared to contradict him. "Sir?" The officer tries to speak first, his voice trembling. "I didn't know. She herself." No sound can justify what has happened. The chief's eyes blaze with contempt. He doesn't need explanations, because now he is looking at the result. His granddaughter, a young black girl, crushed to the pavement because of a wild outburst of racism and a thirst for humiliation. And her overturned wheelchair lies next to her, a mute witness to this terrible injustice. The wheels still seem to spin slowly, reflecting the lights of headlights and sirens. This spinning is hypnotizing, like a symbol of the very endless bullying she has endured in her last minutes. "Chief, listen," his partner interjects, not knowing how to save his comrade. "We thought she was... Well, you know how it is. Everyone here is suspicious." He doesn't have time to finish. The chief's icy gaze slides over him, silencing him at half a word. It was as if anyone who opened his mouth was signing his own sentence. Another siren rumbles, beacons flashing in the night sky. It looks like more help has arriving on the signal that the police chief's granddaughter is in mortal danger. People in the crowd, sensing the approaching hurricane, begin to move farther away, hide in the shadows, turn away. Someone is already too scared to watch the punishment fall on the one who just shouted, "I'll crush you all. You're nothing to me." And this nothing in their eyes had recently been a girl in a wheelchair, but now suddenly turned against the racist officer himself. The police chief cradles his granddaughter in his arms and quietly says something soothing in her ear, though there is a steely note in his own voice that forebodes reprisal. And then he rises to his full height, looking directly at the desolate soul of the officer who has already lost all his insolence. Ruthless rage rolls in the man's chest in a wave, ready to crash down on those who dared to touch his family. More than once he'd seen and eliminated cops with dirty hands who'd let themselves cross the legal line. But to abuse a child in a wheelchair like this, and to openly spew his racist hatred, is beyond him. The night seemed to thicken even more. There was an oppressive silence, broken only by the girl's hoarse breathing and the roar of the SUV's open engine. And in that silence, everyone held their breath, realizing that something unprecedented was about to happen. Something that would change not only the lives of the two policemen, but also the entire neighborhood, which for too long had turned a blind eye to such ruthless antics. The officer, who a moment ago had been spewing his hatred and enjoying his power, now took a step back, feeling his body grow leaden. He reaches for his holster, as if in a desperate attempt to prove his strength, but he realizes that any sudden movement could be his last. Standing before him is the chief of police, the same man whose determination made the most notorious gangsters in this city shudder. But now it's not about the bandits, it's about his granddaughter, who has just been lying on the dirty asphalt next to an overturned wheelchair, humiliated and beaten under his boot. That mangled wheelchair is still lying on its side as if it were a symbol of her helplessness, and people with telephones are frozen above it, frozen in mute expectation. The chief, without saying a word, gently, almost reverently lifts the girl off the ground. She is trembling, unable even to open her lips to complain of pain. Her gaze is an ocean of fear and pain, mixed with a dash of distrust for anyone wearing a police uniform. The man gently holds his granddaughter to his chest, as if trying to keep her shivering with his warmth. The girl sobs, wrapping her arms around his neck with no strength left in them. Her face still bears the marks of humiliation, and her dark-skinned skin is bleached with dust and abrasions, a sad testament to her recent nightmare. At that moment, everything goes silent, as if nature itself was wondering what the police chief, who had felt how far racism had gone within his own system, would do. The officer licks his parched lips, trying to justify himself, but he can't make a sound. Drops of sweat appear on his face, white as if covered with frost, and his hands twitch nervously as he touches his weapon, then jerk away as if he had been burned. The chief gently lowers the girl into a seat in his SUV, having previously placed an overturned wheelchair nearby. And now he turns around to the frightened officer. His gaze is so cold that even the surrounding gawkers feel an icy prick running down their backs. No one dares to approach or speak. Everyone is waiting to see what will happen in that frightening second. The silence seems to permeate the air with a thick fog. Seconds seem as long as hours. Some in the crowd know how ruthless the chief is to those who break the law or dishonor the uniform. But no one can guess how he will act now that the insult has been inflicted on him and his family personally. It's as if he's in a dilemma. Follow the letter of the law, order the officer to be detained and investigated, or unleash the rage in his heart and exact his revenge right here, without regard for the law. "Chief," the officer tried to squeeze out, his voice sounding muffled and pathetic. "Minus I admit, I didn't know it was yours, but she's," he stammered, as if searching for words to justify his racist shouting. "I thought she was kind of suspicious." At those words, the chief squints his eyes, a faint flare of frenzy slipping into them. "Is she suspicious?" he interjects as if without a sound. And suddenly he takes a step forward, a sharp, measured step. The resounding tread of boots on asphalt elicits a tense breath from the crowd. The officer backs away, but bumps into a patrol car and realizes that there is no further escape. The chief's gaze says eloquently, "You made a choice to humiliate her, to trample on her dignity, to pour all the nastiness of your darkness on her. And now you're going to answer for it." It's so quiet, someone whispers a prayer. I wish he hadn't killed him. But at the same time, temptation flashes in someone's eyes. Many people have seen how ruthless a racist policeman can be, and how many of these cases have been hushed up. And now the map is different. The victim turned out to be the granddaughter of the police chief himself, and that changes everything. The chief slowly runs his hand over the holster, as if checking to see if the weapon is in place. The officer does not take his eyes off these movements, and it seems that his heart is already pounding like a hunted animal in a cage. The crowd freezes, for they realize that any spark could lead to instant reprisals. But the chief still doesn't say a word. He walks around the officer, examining him from head to toe, fixing on his sharp eyes every detail: the unfortunate uniform, dirty boots, a face contorted with a mixture of fear and remorse. At some point, their gazes cross, and the officer almost faints, because he sees in his superior's face a rage comparable to the forces of nature that cannot be contained. And then something new glimmers in his eyes, a thought that is visible to the naked eye. What will he choose? Wondered everyone from the crowd of onlookers to his even more frightened partner. Detain him according to procedure, or use his fists, or, more terrifyingly, a gun? The rumble of sirens interrupts the prolonged pause. Somewhere in the distance, cars from the station are approaching them to help the chief's granddaughter and investigate the incident. Those cars are the ones he called or pulled up on the alarm code. But will there be anything there to investigate after the chief personally executes retribution? Finally, the police chief nods faintly, as if making a decision. He gives the racist cop one last piercing look, a look of contempt, as if the officer were not just a criminal, but a real monster who dared to touch the family. And in that moment, the officer involuntarily feels that he would rather have the chief beat the hell out of him right here than face what the law will do to him when the truth about his exploits is revealed. The seconds drag on forever. The crowd waits tensely for the outcome, and the officer and the chief stare at each other like two predators on the verge of a fight. And only one question hangs in the cold, tension-soaked air. Will the police chief choose the path of truth and law, or let his own anger take over, crushing the vile individual who has terrorized the city with his racist attacks? In the eyes of the chief reads the fire of internal struggle, and no one can predict how this crazy nightmare will end. In the morning, every news channel, every newspaper, and even random online resources are full of loud headlines. Racist scandal in police, girl in wheelchair victimized by officer brutality, chief's granddaughter assaulted by subordinate. People who a week ago preferred not to notice the cruelty on the streets are now dumbfounded to reread the same thing. A young officer has disappeared. He disappeared without a trace, as if he had vanished into the darkness that he himself had created by his own actions. The crowd of onlookers who witnessed this tragedy are now hiding in their homes, pulling down the curtains and avoiding the gaze of their neighbors. No one wants to admit that they stood by and watched a racist policeman abuse a helpless, dark-skinned girl, knocking over her wheelchair and crushing her face into the asphalt. Everyone pretends as if they saw nothing, knew nothing, because fear flashes in their eyes. If the police chief himself is able to wipe out his own officer, what can he do to the rest of us who let that racist do this atrocity? Rumors spread through the city like poisonous snakes. Some say the officer was locked in some secret cellar, others say he fled to escape imminent reprisal, and still others are sure that the chief of police himself settled the score with him. But no one has a clear answer. And it is this uncertainty that makes the city panic-stricken. Everyone feels that after this night, the usual order of things will not return. The unfortunate street where all this madness unfolded now seems to have died out in the mornings. The few who dare to go out turn away from every rustle, hurriedly stepping over puddles and stains on the asphalt, trying not to remember that something unimaginably cruel had happened here not so long ago. It would seem that people have gotten justice. The most egregious racist in uniform has disappeared, and it is clear to everyone that the chief of police is behind it. But why does cold fear still run through the veins of the townspeople? In the end, as ruthless power shifted from police officer to police chief on the doorstep of that very night, a girl in a wheelchair remained at the center of this tragedy. She herself no longer believes in compassion or the law. Her haggard face flashes across the front pages of the newspapers, and journalists are scrambling to interview her, trying to make her guilt and retribution look almost sensational. But she rejects all requests, immersed in total emptiness. Sitting at home, in the same wheelchair that had the misfortune to roll over on the cold asphalt, she stares out the window with a blank stare. There are no more tears, no more screams, not even the fierce fear that gripped her heart that night. All that's left is a heavy emptiness in her chest. It was as if a part of her soul was left lying there, on the street, where the officer had thrown her face down, spitting out vicious, racist profanity. And no one, not the whispers of sympathizers, not the noise of the headlines, not even her grandfather's stern defense, can make her believe that justice has been served. She feels that she has lost faith in people and in the future. The town is frozen in an invisible tension. Some secretly gloat because the officer has received the punishment he deserves, while others are horrified to realize that evil can come from anywhere, even from those who wear the uniform and are sworn to protect. But the central figure in this tragedy, the girl herself, wants no revenge and craves no high-profile trials. She doesn't care anymore. She has experienced too much disappointment and fear in one night. In her eyes, there is only an unutterable emptiness. This is how the story ends, leaving behind neither a complete justice nor a comforting denouement. All people are left with are the painful questions of how a city proud of its laws could allow such ugly racism and savage violence. And every time they read the morning headlines, citizens involuntarily lower their gaze, knowing that the true cost of such stories is not just the missing racist cop, but someone's murdered faith in humanity. We really want to know what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism in your life? Share your opinion in the comments. It's really important to us, and we appreciate each and every one of you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and put a like if you liked it. Write a phrase in the comments that confirms that you listened to the story to the end. We wish you a good day. For 5 seconds, write what you think about this story in the comments. Have you experienced racism in your life, and how did you deal with it? We truly value your opinion and appreciate everyone who listens to our stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like to support us. We wish you a good day and suggest you write in the comments the phrase, "I listened to the end," so that we realize that you were with us from the beginning to the end.